As mentioned, the enemy of the Trojans were the Achaeans, a race of, I quote, fair and bright-eyed peoples, unquote, leading one to assume warriors fair in complexion with blue eyes, much like the Nordic races of Northern Europe, around the North and Baltic Seas. Again, we have more to discuss on this later. Still, the Achaeans, even according to the mainstream sources, are said to be the ancestors of the Greeks. So, even though you do get some translations where people call the Achaeans the Greeks, the Achaeans are actually the ancestors of the Greeks, older. Hence the use of the word Greeks, used to describe these peoples in some translations. It is also accepted that the Achaeans are an Indo-European race that invaded the area of Greece today from the north, though the debate still rages to if this was an invasion or resettling, and whether it was by land or by sea. Some researchers believe the Achaeans were no other than the infamous sea peoples, who came from the Atlantic coastal regions, whom caused major disruption around the Mediterranean. Is it possible that refugees from a war in England in the 11th century BCE settled in the areas around the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey? Could the story of the Trojan War, the mythology and language have migrated with them? One may presume that the Achaeans, or the Achoi, as actually described by Homer, meant sea peoples, deriving from the Indo-Germanic aqua, meaning water or stream, later becoming the Gothic acha, and then later the Latin aqua. This evolution continues around the major civilizations of the Mediterranean. We're talking etymologically now. The word Ahijawa by the Hittites in Asia Minor and Akiwasa by the Egyptians both roughly means the sea or water peoples. Interesting to note there, on a side note, that the Hittites, who were the main dominating force also in that region, make no reference of a Trojan War and 1,000 ships sailing across the Aegean. There's absolutely no reference to it whatsoever, but they do make reference to the famous conflict with Ramesses, but that's for another time. The iteration Acheawa, Achewia, found in Linear B, seems to be the oldest known name of Greece, translating into land of sea people. Linear B was a syllabic script used for writing in Mycenaean Greek, the earliest attested form of Greek. The script predates the Greek alphabet by several centuries, with the oldest Mycenaean writing dating to around 1400 BCE. It is descended from the older Linear A, an undeciphered earlier script used for writing the Minoan language. We'll have more to come on the writing systems later, to be fair. Homer makes mentions of the, quote, Argives and Danans, sometimes when referencing the attacking forces of the war. People generally accept the former to mean that of the Isle of Argos in the Mediterranean. However, Iman Wilkins believes this Argos was actually in Western Europe, or more specifically in modern-day France, and the Danans are named so after Danas, who was the king of Argos, believed to be in France. Could these Greek Achaean soldiers, also referenced as Danans or Argives, ruled by their great warrior commander Agamemnon, chief of the war, elected by all the other kings, have come from mainland northwestern Europe? Iman believes the Hellas Sea was the body of water we know today as the English Channel / North Sea, that area there. Homer actually does mention the Achaeans as crossing a, quote here, crossing a wine-coloured body of water en route to Troy, unquote. And to me that does, well, otherwise known as Ilium, as Homer named the city in his poems, which is closer in complexion to the English Channel than that of the clear blue waters of the Aegean. You know, you think of that part of the world and you do not picture wine-coloured water. The writing of Homer's works was said to be written in Ionian Greek. Again, no originals survive, leading one to believe the Ionians would have played a major part in the conflict, when in fact they are referenced only once in the poems. According to the Greek chronicler Thucydides, living around the 5th century BCE, the Ionians were in fact the Greeks, and that they did not possess a fleet of ships until centuries later. So that's in the 5th century BCE. Thucydides is saying that the Greeks didn't even have a fleet of ships, so never mind 1, 2, 3, 700 years before that having a fleet of ships. I shall take this moment to explain the dates that may be possible for the war. According to Homer's works, it is believed the war took place around the 11th century BCE. This time frame seems likely for the first of two potential wars, most likely taking place in East Anglia in England, whilst a much later date of the 7th century is given by Wilson and Blackett of a conflict in Anatolia. The later date would allow for the Greek states of the Aegeon to potentially, again bearing in mind what Thucydides has just said, to be more established and have a much needed fleet of ships to launch a campaign, though according to Dares, who also we shall come on to in a moment, Greece had no fleet. According to Plato, whilst in Egypt he was told of the Atlanteans warring with the state of Athens in their distant past. Could this have been the migrating force after the fall of Troy in England, migrating from the Atlantic regions perhaps? But I digress on that notion, and we shall look at the migrations further when we come to Brutus and his founding of kingship in Britain during what would become the Brythonic period, one might say, after the renaming of the island from Albion, of which we still pay homage to in the naming of Britain after him today. It is no secret that many names of the locations found in the Iliad are littered around the Mediterranean, but few realise they are also to be found in the northwest of Europe. I will source out more names and stuff for that in a future video, indicating a transference of peoples and knowledge either east to west, or as I am beginning to believe, from west to east, after the fall of the first city of Troy millennia ago. I should also mention other locations had the name Troy at varying times in history, from Iceland to Turkey, with several in England alone. We have Troia Nova, later named Trinobantum, which is today modern London. A town of Troy can also be found even to this day in modern day Surrey, and I have put that in a previous video somewhere. A name mentioned earlier in the video, one Snorri Sturluson, in his prologue to his works, the Eddas, references that Asgard also went by the name of Troy, which must have been at least pre the 12th century due to the age of his works, and remember, his works was a compilation of older works. I do not claim Asgard and Troy are one and the same, though this correlation I found interesting, and it's really interesting. The writings of Homer's poems have many points of contention, and we are only just beginning to build a picture. Homer makes several references also to the tides when discussing the sailing fleet, the beaching of the vessels, and channels cut into the sand to allow the ships to land as far up the beach as possible. And to be honest, I'm not going to go too much into like the tides and the seas and things like that in this video. We'll probably cover that in a later video, but I advise anyone to look into it for themselves, as with all of this material. There is plenty more to come in terms of the geography of both Troy in England and Hisarlik in Anatolia, and there's a lot to cover. Let us take a short look now at the writings of Dares the Phrygian, who also makes reference to the events before the Trojan War. One such event is the destruction of Troy by none other than Hercules, who destroyed and plundered the city. So to quote Dares now, "They came from Sigium at night, Hercules, Telamon, and Peleus led the army into the country, leaving Castor and Pollux and Nestor behind to guard the ships. just say that quick though. Castor and Pollux. That makes me think of Ferrex and Pollux, named, discussed by Geoffrey of Monmouth. He discusses very similar names. So they were left behind to guard the ships. When news was brought to King Laomedon that the Greek fleet had landed at Sigium, he took command of the cavalry for himself and went to the shore to begin hostilities. Cha-ching, cha-ching. But Hercules, having gone to Troy, was beginning to besiege the unsuspecting inhabitants of the city. When Laomedon learned what was happening at home, he tried to return, but the Greeks stood in his way and Hercules slew him. Telamon proved his prowess by being the first one to enter the city of Troy. Therefore Hercules gave him Laomedon's daughter Hesione. Needless to say, all those who went with Laomedon were killed. At this time Priam was in Phrygia, where Laomedon, his father, had put him in charge of the army. Hercules and those who came with him plundered the city, the country, and carried off much booty to their ships. When they decided to set off home, Telamon took Hesione with him. When the news brought to Priam that his father had been killed, his fellow citizens decimated, his country plundered, and his sister carried off as spoils of war, he was deeply upset to think the Greeks had treated Phrygia in such contempt. He travelled to Troy along with his wife Hecuba and his children Hector, Alexander, Deiphobos, Helenus, Troilus, Andromache, Cassandra, and Polyxena. He had other sons by concubines, but only those by lawfully wedded wives could claim to be true royal lineage. Arriving in Troy, he saw to the maximum fortification of the city. He built stronger walls and stationed a greater number of soldiers nearby. Troy should not fall again as it had under his father Laomedon, due to a lack of preparedness. He also constructed an altar and statue to Jupiter, sent Hector into Paeonia, built the gates of Troy. The gates are as follows, to be fair: the Antenorian, the Dardanian, the Ilian, the Scian, and the Thymbraean, and the Trojan gate. When he saw that Troy was secure, he waited until the time seemed right to avenge his father, all that his father had suffered. Then he summoned Antenor, and he wished him to go as an envoy to Greece. The Greek army, he said, had done him grave wrongs by killing his father Laomedon and by carrying off Hesione. Nevertheless, if Hesione was returned, he would cease to complain. Unquote. So there we have King Priam mentions the Phrygians being treated in such contempt, which I take to mean the Trojan people are Phrygian. Indeed, Priam himself was in Phrygia when his father was slain by Hercules, which will be significant later down the road as we go deeper into the Trojan War, the Trojan peoples, and who they were in relation to Phrygia and Brutus. Antenor boards a ship and does as his king Priam requests and sets sail to find an agreement to bring back Hesione. Interesting to note that whenever the Trojans visit Greece, the Greeks, the use of boats is vital and ultimately necessary, and you've just got to think back to what Dares and Thucydides have said. There was no fleet of ships. That's in the 5th century. Of course, Dares is believed to have been around the Trojan War himself. Given that Greece is made up of many islands and supposed states littered around the Aegean, one would think if one was to visit these states, then the need for ships and for travel is of course vital, as I've just said. However, as mentioned by Thucydides earlier on, and Dares in a moment, they didn't have any ships. So quoting from Dares again now: Immediately Priam summoned his sons and all of his friends, Antenor, Anchises, Aeneas, who was obviously well known, Bucolion, Panthus, and Lampus, and all of the sons he had fathered by concubines. When they had come, he told them about Antenor's unsuccessful mission, how he had gone to Greece and demanded a satisfaction for Laomedon's death and the return of Ageon, and how the Greeks had treated him scornfully and sent him home empty-handed. Now Priam concluded, since the Greeks refused to do as he wished, he would send an army to make them pay for their crimes, lest they think barbarians worthy of scorn. And he urged his sons, especially Hector, since he was the oldest, to take command of the forces. Hector responded by saying that he would carry out his father's wishes and avenge the death of his grandfather, Laomedon, and the other injustices the Greeks had done to the Trojans. Bear in mind, this is a translation where it refers to the Achaeans as Greeks. I could replace that in a heartbeat. He feared, however, that the Trojan expedition would fail, for Europe had bred, get on this, many warlike men who would come to the aid of Greece. Many European warlike men who would come to the aid of Greece. Then Alexander began to extort them. They must build a fleet and go against Greece. If his father wished, he would take charge of this venture. He would conquer the enemy and return from Greece with great renown. And we see this of Arthur 1, also when he goes into Europe and destroys Rome and stuff, or conquers Rome. There was reason to believe that the gods would aid him, for while hunting in the woods on Mount Ida, he had fallen asleep and dreamt as follows. Mercury brought Juno, Venus, and Minerva to him to judge of their beauty. Then Venus promised, if he judged her most beautiful, to give him in marriage whoever was deemed the loveliest woman in Greece, Venus being Aphrodite. Thus finally, on hearing Venus's promise, he judged her most beautiful. This dream inspired Priam, and with hope that Venus would aid Alexander, and Deiphobus approved of what Alexander had said. He believed that the Greeks would return his sister Hesione and make reparations if, as had been proposed, they would send a fleet against Greece. Helenus, however, began to predict that if Alexander brought home a Greek wife, the Greeks would pursue and overpower Troy, and slay, O cruel might, his parents and brothers. But Troilus, who though the youngest of Priam's sons, equalled Hector in bravery, urged them to war, and told them not to be frightened by Helenus's fearful words.